What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Virginia Wingard YouTube channel. Today we are continuing on. We're continuing going with our series, What is the Bible? This week we are actually in episode 6 of our What is the Bible series. My name's Sarah Kate, and I am so glad you have joined me today. Let's jump in. So we know that the majority of the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. That was the language of the Israelites. But the millennium before Christ, Aramaic actually began to become more of a popular language with trade routes and other areas. So it actually took over as an official language of the Persian Empire. There are 3 sections of the Old Testament that were written in Aramaic. These sections are Ezra, chapters 4 through 6. This is all about when the Persian kings are talking about rebuilding Jerusalem. That's written in Aramaic. The letter of authorization in Ezra chapter 7 is written in Aramaic, and a large portion of the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic. The Old Testament clearly was written by hand and copied by hand, so that not every copy of the Old Testament was the exact same as the other copy of the Old Testament, which meant early on in the Old Testament there was an effort to standardize the text of the Old Testament. And since some of the text was in Hebrew and some in Aramaic, and also remember several weeks ago we talked about how Hebrew does not have vowels. It has vowel sounds, but it doesn't have vowels in its written text. So by the 8th century, the Hebrew words there were no spaces between the words. Because of this, copyists made mistakes. Human error occurred. One example of having no vowels and having no spaces between words is the phrase computer network. If you spelled it CMPTRNTWRK, that grouping of letters could spell out computer network, or it could also spell out came Peter to work. So that's a good example of what the Hebrew text how it could be misinterpreted. Because there are no vowel sounds, the context really depends on understanding the text there. Also, don't forget, we talked about the Masoretes before, and the Masoretes were the group of guys who added the dots and the dots in and around the letters of Hebrew text to add the vowel sounds in after the fact. The Masoretes would spend time making sure that any difficult to understand words had indications on how they were supposed to be read, and they would also often write synonyms or explanations in the margins to help cut down any misinterpretation. The Masoretes were all about comprehension of the text. They wanted everyone to understand what was going on. So that's why they were adding the vowel sounds. But they did not change any part of the text. They left the text that they were writing, adding these vowel sounds into, they left the text alone. Even in the case of leaving words that were archaic or expressions that were no longer used, they didn't just willy-nilly change these archaic words because they knew no one would understand them. Instead, they added to. They did not take away from, they added to, and added an explanation, added synonyms to help the comprehension of the text. One example of this can be found in Genesis chapter 14, verse number 2. It says, "These kings went to war against Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah," a few other kings, "and the king of Bela," in parentheses, that is Zor. In other words, the Masoretes knew that the place named Bela was no longer in existence, so they gave extra context to show Bela has now been renamed, and these people would know it now as Zor. So instead of taking out the word Bela and putting in Zor, they added to the text to make it apparent what the author was talking about. Moving on to the New Testament, we know it's primarily written in Greek. From very early on, the copies were made of the earliest New Testament writings to be sent, to be shared with other churches. And the New Testament, really, the letters of the New Testament were copied and copied and copied over and over and over again for that sharing process, for the ability to share that text with other people and other churches and other early Christians in the same area. Early manuscripts of the New Testament. Let's talk about, there are right now 4,000 known manuscripts of the Bible made between the 2nd century and 15th century AD. These 4,000 manuscripts are divided into 2 different categories. There's the unicals category, and there's the cursives category. Unicals, which are these large capital block type letters, there are 160 different unical manuscripts, and these were made between the 4th and 10th centuries. So these were a later, or I guess earlier edition, and then later on, the cursives started being copied and written and produced, and the cursives are small running letters, and these were made between the 10th and 15th centuries. So this is an example of the unicals shape and form and what the unical writing looked like. And then this is an example of what the cursives form looked like. You can see the difference in the shape of letters, how big the letters are, how they sit together. The 3 oldest, most complete, best known, and most valuable manuscripts of the New Testament are the Codex Sinaiticus, which we talked about before. We mentioned that in a previous episode. The Codex Vaticanus, and the Codex Alexandrinus. All 3 of these were originally complete Bibles. So in a previous video, I told you we were going to talk about the Codex Sinaiticus again. Well, now's the time. I want to tell you how this came to be, how this first codex came to be. There's a guy by the name of LFK von Tischendorf. He was a German scholar, and he went to the monastery of St. Catherine, which is right near Mount Sinai. And he went there in 1844, and when he did, he found 43 vellum pages in a wastebasket with Greek written on them. Next to, remember we talked about the Codex Sinaiticus was found because it was about to be burned. Well, von Tischendorf found these 43 vellum pages in like a wastebasket right next to a fireplace, going to be used as fire starter. So he collected these 43 pages, he looked at them, and he realized, okay, this is part of the Septuagint, the Old Testament pages. He searched for more pages around that same area. He came back several times to monastery at St. Catherine's and continues to search for pages of this same text. Couldn't find any. Until one day he went back in 1859, and von Tischendorf just happened to be talking to a steward that was working at the monastery about these 43 pages that he found, and the steward said, "Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. I have some." So the steward went to his room, got these other pages of this text that he had wrapped delicately in a paper napkin and gave it to von Tischendorf. Von Tischendorf finally, he had actually found, with this extra text, these extra pages from the steward and the 43 he had found originally, he had 199 pages of the Old Testament. He had the entire New Testament, plus some extra stories that are in the Apocrypha now. This is the Codex Sinaiticus, and it is the only ancient manuscript that contains the entire New Testament. Oh, I also want to just briefly talk about the Codex Vaticanus. This codex was made in the 4th century. It's right now being stored in the Vatican Library. It's been there since 1481. And in this codex, there are some sections of the New Testament missing. And then there's the Codex From early on, let's switch to talking about the creation of Bibles throughout time. Let's talk a little bit about the problems with copies. So prior to the first invention of the printing press, the very first printing press where you had the little metal letters that you put in upside down and then run paper through, before a copy machine, before any of that, everyone was writing over and over again the entire Bible, or what they had of the Bible, based on different areas. Last episode we talked about how the variations occurred in different areas around the Middle East. They were copying this over and over by hand. Copyists, this was their job, to sit in a room and copy this text by hand. The problem with these copies is that there are so many variants that show up in early manuscripts. And usually these variants that show up are the mistake of the copyist. They're almost very rarely are they intentional changes made to the text. I want to show, this is some Greek line. And I can't read Greek, but when I typed this in, I said I wanted the very first verses of John, the chapter John. So I think this is the first chapter of John, the beginning of the first chapter of John. And as you can tell, the upper line, there's an ending that looks exactly the same as another ending. You can see the first line ends with okay, I don't know Greek letters. I'm not going to try to learn Greek letters just for this part of the video. You guys know exactly what I'm talking about when I say this, okay? The very first line looks like it ends with N-O, upside down V, O, upside down L, O, E, okay? Then if you go down to the third line, it ends with the same exact letters. This is what would happen when a copyist would read the, V, upside down V-O, upside down L-O-E, skip down to the third line, and it's there again, so their eye would jump to that area. So the problems, almost all copyist issues can be broken down into two separate categories. First, let's say copyist A makes the mistake of jumping a line. Like we just talked about in the Greek, he jumps a line and he skips a line. Now, everything that is copied from copyist A makes that same mistake. They leave out that one line. Let's say there's another copyist who makes the mistake of writing the same word over again accidentally. So now you have one copyist, copyist A, leaves out one line. Then copyist B writes the same word twice. Then copyist C comes along and they're copying from copyist B's copy. No, any further copies of copyist A's mistake of skipping the line will always be there. Any further copies of copyist B's mistake of writing the same word twice will always be there. And so that's how we get such variations of the text based on the inconsistencies of these copyists. Before we get into the various translations of the Bible, we're going to talk about two types of original translation. The first type of original translation is what's called majority text translation. And any variations found in the majority of all manuscripts of the Bible are the closest to the original text. That's what the majority text translation believes. So any problems, if copyist B made a mistake and that double word is in there in this one complete text, but then all the other manuscripts of the Bible also have that double word, the majority text form of translation believes leave the double word in because the majority of the manuscripts have that double word. The King James Version of the Bible is based on a Greek manuscript that represents the majority text. The second version or variation of original translation is called critical text translation. So for each variant in a manuscript, the critical text translator would go back and determine which variant is found in the oldest manuscripts, or they would decide if it could be explained away as a copyist error. So in the same example, one of the copyists in the manuscript really early on has written a word twice. Instead of using all the majority of the text, like majority text translation, they go back to, they see if they can find a manuscript prior to that mistake that does not have that double word in it, or based on the text and critical thinking, they see if that was clearly a copyist error. A double word is clearly a copyist error. So, in critical text, they're not basing it on the majority of the text. They're basing it on, does the oldest text, the oldest manuscript have this in it? Or can it be explained as a copyist mistake? So one example, one translation example of the critical text is the NIV translation. So we're keeping these two variations of translation in mind as we jump into translation here. The very early church had the whole Bible, Old and New Testaments, translated into Greek. So that's your first whole Bible translation is Greek, okay? As the church spread out, it reached countries where Greek was not the most used language. Our first big translation from Greek came in the 2nd century AD. And this first translation, main translation, whole Bible translation from Greek is Old Syriac. This was used by Syrians. Then there was another more simplified translation from Old Syriac to Peshitta. I'm going to put that word up here. I hope I'm saying it correctly. Peshitta, this was the 4th century, and this was a simplified version of Old Syriac. Then, okay, so that was the 4th century. Greek to Old Syriac to Peshitta, 4th century. And then in the 2nd century, the Old Latin translation was created. In the Old Latin translation, the Old Testament was translated not from Hebrew, but from the Septuagint. Then in AD 382 to 404, the biblical scholar Jerome, realized that the Old Latin version translation was really inadequate. So that's when we get the Vulgate translation. This is a revision of the Old Latin translation, the Vulgate. The Old Latin translation, the Old Testament, was not translated from Hebrew. It was translated from the Septuagint. Jerome in the Vulgate translated the entire Old Testament from Hebrew. And then the Vulgate became the Bible of the Western world for 1,000 years. It was the Vulgate was where it stopped for a long period of time as far as translation went. So now, because we speak English, I'm going to talk about the very first English translations of the Bible. There were other translations in between the Vulgate. When we did our live Sunday school class on our Facebook page live on Sunday, I asked you guys what you thought was the very first English translation of the Bible. I want you to pause the video and I want you to comment down below, what do you think the first English translation of the Bible was? So the first translations into Anglo-Saxon, which was an earliest form of English, portions of the Bible made around AD 700, 900 years before the King James Version was created. So if you put King James Version, you're a little too late. The first true, fully English translation of the Bible is Wycliffe's Bible. Wycliffe's translation was published in 1382. Okay, so Wycliffe's Bible existed only in manuscript form, but prior to the printing press, which was invented 70 years after the Wycliffe Bible was invented by Gutenberg. Not a lot of copies, because it was handwritten, were in circulation, but it was the first early English translation. And the Roman Catholic Church hated it. You may have heard stories, really believe in the Roman Catholic Church that the priest and the church is supposed to represent the scripture to the people. And so Wycliffe's Bible allowed everyone to read from the Bible in a language that they completely understood, and this did not sit well with the Roman Catholic Church. They actually condemned him, and he was excommunicated, and a lot of these early copies of the Bible that were written in early English were actually burned because of this scandalous ability for everyone to read the Word of God. Then, after the Wycliffe Bible in 1525, so Wycliffe's translation 1382, in 1525 we get Tyndale's Bible. So this was much more accurate translation than Wycliffe's, since it was translated from Greek and from Hebrew. And Tyndale was actually breaking a bunch of rules too. He was trying to translate the Bible into English. The church found out he wanted to translate the Bible into English and provide it to all people. He had to flee from England. He had to travel around and move a bunch of places and hide the New Testament he was working on. He printed it and smuggled it back into England. And he got into a bunch of trouble as well for translating the Bible. In fact, Tyndale on October 6th, 1536 was burned at the stake for translating the Bible into English. These first two guys, Wycliffe and Tyndale, were breaking what had been for thousands of years a really consistent structure of the church providing the Bible to the people. And it was really difficult for people to let go of the control of the Bible and allow people to use it, whoever needed it to use it. Other early English translations of the Bible were the Coverdale Bible. This is from 1535. And this was from Dutch and Latin sources. The Rogers Bible comes about in 1537, almost wholly entirely copied from the Tyndale Bible. And the Great Bible is the name of it, came about in 1539, and it was a compilation of Tyndale's Bible, Wycliffe's Bible, Tyndale's Bible, Rogers, and Coverdale Bible. Then the Geneva Bible came about. This was 1560, and it was translated by a group of scholars who had fled from England to Geneva, and this is the city of John Calvin. And most of you probably know who that is. Now, 1560, the Geneva Bible. These scholars go to the city of John Calvin. They're translating the Bible into English. 1560. The Geneva Bible is an important Bible because this is the first Bible that added chapter and verse. The division of the Bible into verses was done by Robert Essene of Paris, who was a printer of Greek New Testaments. Think about that, up until 1560, there were no verses in the Bible. So if you were referencing an area of the Bible, you just really had to know where it was. There was no writing out chapter and verse of the Bible. There were no verses. Now, finally, after all these translations, we finally get to what I really thought prior to looking into this was one of the earliest English translations, and it wasn't, the King James Version of the Bible. A lot of you I know still use the King James Version. Maybe you have a King James Bible. So King James of Scotland was crowned King James of England. One of the very early measures that King James took was to create this sense of unity among religions and religious people. And in order to do that, he wanted to create a new Bible translation to be used by all churches in England. This early King James Version of the Bible was published by these 54 scholars who got together and used different sources to make their translations. It was published in 1611. The King James Version of the Bible was revised in 1615, 1629, 1638, 1762. If you have a King James Version of the Bible now, check the front of it and see when the revision was. But I think the most recent or the current King James Version is from 1762. Then it was now that the translators adopted the chapter distinctions. So in the Geneva Bible, we get the addition of verses. In the King James Version of the Bible, we get the addition of chapters. So if you've read a King James Bible recently, maybe you really like it, but also maybe you find it extremely difficult to understand. King James is notorious for using thee and thou and thine, and the language is really different from what our English is today. But when the King James Version of the Bible was created, that is how people spoke. That was a regular, it was just like I'm speaking to you right now. It was really easily understood. And it became extremely popular. And it's famous because early on, a lot of people could finally understand the text of the Bible. It was written for the people to understand. Early people who spoke like that could absolutely, it was just like reading an NIV Bible for you and me today. It was very easily accessible for people of that time period. But over time, that complete understanding of the King James Version Bible kind of diminished. It became harder and harder as language grew, as the English language changed over time. It became harder to understand. So here's an example. This is from James chapter 1. This is verse 21. King James Version says this: "Wherefore lay apart all filthiness and superfluity of naughtiness." I don't know what that means. This is not common English. No one would say that to you today, okay? This is the same exact verse in the NIV translation. "Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent." Because of this change in English, change in dynamic, newer, more modern versions of translation began to be really popular. And around 1901, the American Standard Version translation was created. Throughout this time period, the early 18th century, 1901, ASV was created. 1903, Weymouth's New Testament came about. Moffat's translation, 1926. Smith and Godspeed translation, 1923. So early 1959, Berkeley version of the Bible. A lot of new creations of Bibles and translations were being created in this century. But it wasn't until 1978 that the most popular translation was created. And that is, can you guess, the NIV version. New International Version, created in 1978. is the single most used modern translation of the Bible. In fact, it has outsold and surpassed the King James Version of the Bible since 1993. So that's it for translations. We've gone from Greek to NIV. That's where we were leading up to. We may talk again next week about a little bit about translation, but we're about to really dig into the text here. And I hope you'll join along on this journey through the Bible. Thanks for joining in. Thanks for being here. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Make sure to subscribe to our channel. And I'll see you guys next time.